There's all kinds of blindness. Many of us see, yet we do not really see. And this story from John's Gospel is a great example of that, isn't it? I grew up understanding blindness pretty well. I had a friend growing up in Gainesville who, when we were in Boy Scouts together, he was kind of handed over to me as my charge. And he taught me all kinds of interesting things about helping people who are not sighted. You know, you let them take your arm. You don't ever grab them. Let them tell you what they need. He was a musician. He was very talented. He had perfect pitch, for instance, was one thing. He could tune my guitar without a guitar tuner, in other words. And later on in his life, this was several years later, after I hadn't seen him probably for 30 years, I was at a reunion for our Boy Scout troop. And he had had an operation on his eyes that had restored his sight to where he could now actually see people. And he had these very thick glasses on. But I walked over and I stood at his table and he just looked at me for the longest time. And then I said, and I'm changing his name, I said, John, it's Tim. And as soon as I said my name and used my voice, he went, oh, hey, yeah, it is you, isn't it? That his brain had not quite caught up with his eyes yet. And they say that's what happens when now there's a lot of miraculous treatments for certain kinds of blindness. When people have their sight restored after not being able to see most of their lives, it takes their brains a little while to catch up to understand, that a dog is a dog and a tree is a tree, and to be able to read faces, for instance. That's an amazingly hard thing for our brains to do, as it turns out. And he could not see us most of his life, but boy, he had such sight. He could listen in a way that we couldn't. He could hear things that we couldn't hear. He understood things that we didn't understand. And I think today we see a wonderful illustration of the different kinds of blindness, because we have in the scene a man who was, for all intents and purposes, a homeless man sitting by this pool, or sitting around the temple begging, and suddenly he's healed, and he's hauled in before the teachers and the authorities to explain what happened. And he keeps trying to explain it to them, and he explains it to them perfectly, but they don't see it. They keep saying to him, well, obviously you're lying. No. Well, who is this man? He must be some kind of trickery. No. Well, we're holy and you're not, so goodbye. And they dismiss him because what they have seen before them doesn't match up with their reality. Their souls and their hearts have not caught up with their eyes yet. And this is really the human condition, isn't it? We all have all kinds of blindness. We fail to see the person sitting across the table from us as a child of God. During a time of fear like this, we let our fear, as Elizabeth Gilbert says, we let our fear drive instead of riding along. And it causes us not to see each other. And it causes us not to see God at work in the world. And I know it's hard to see this time. Every time I wake up in the morning and open the news, the numbers get greater, and there's more sick, and there's more people who've died, and restrictions are getting greater and greater, and it weighs more and more heavily on us. But the truth of the gospel, friends, is that God is still at work in the world. That Jesus is still at work in our lives and in our hearts. That God is still there giving us sight so that we can see. And so this is our prayer during this time. My siblings in Christ, that we every day have our sight restored, so that we may really see, so that our hearts and our minds can catch up with our eyes. And we can see God at work in the world. And we can see God at work in our lives, and we can see God at work in one another. This is going to be a time, friends, when our mission field is in our very own house. And when our mission field might be within our neighborhood. And our mission field is going to be on our Facebook profile and on our Twitter feed. And in the interactions we have people on our phones. People are going to be scared and angry and hopeless. And if we can keep our eyes fixed upon Jesus, if we can keep our eyes true with God's eyesight, and see one another as God's children, and see God at work in the world through this and around this and within this, we can offer a word of hope to a world that is broken, a world that is scared, a world that is lost right now. So, God give us true sight. God help us to see. Amen.
Amen.